Morning, everybody. Morning. How many, just so I kind of know who I'm talking to, how many people in the room are designers? Okay, so still about 50% from this morning. How many of you guys sketch every day? A couple, so that's good. I hope by the end of the day, we'll hopefully provide a reason for you guys to do that every day, or at least up your kind of frequency. So, rapid concept visualization. This is a little bit about what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit about me, just enough so you guys could try to hopefully trust me and be like, okay, this guy kind of knows what he's talking about. And then we'll talk a little bit about the history of the sketch. It's something that is really deeply ingrained in kind of the human experience. And then the types of sketches, when to do the right level of visualization. And then I'll try not to blabber on the whole time, so we have a little bit of time to do some Q&A. Does that sound good? Yeah. All right, cool, because I'm really not going to rearrange the slides now, so this is going to be it. This is it. So, when I was starting to put together this talk, Scott Robinson asked me to put together a talk on rapid visualization. A lot about what we're talking about today is about kind of methodologies and kind of big picture thinking. But when you kind of think of a designer, right, when you think of an architect or a fashion designer or a car designer, you almost think of them as sketching, right? And this is what I told my parents when I was 13 years old. They said, Michael, what do you want to do when you grow up? And I said, I want to draw stuff from the future. And a very kind of succinct, innocent, naive way of saying what I do, but I don't know if I could actually come up with a shorter description still, many years later. And I think like when I'm having a good day, it's because I did that day, right? And so, as Alan mentioned, I tried to put a lot of content online. There's a lot of YouTube videos and Instagram videos showing my process, my thinking process. But the interesting thing about sketching is that while it's a means to an end, it's a moment in time. It's not what we sell as designers, right? Like we sell a solution, we sell an idea, and it's not what our clients sell. Our clients sell a service or a product, but it's just a way of getting there. It represents that kind of like brief moment in time. And for me, that's the goal, right? Like the goal for me is, these are just some of the products I brought to market over the last 20 years. The goal is to bring something to market that's going to affect people's lives. So that's kind of the what, right? And it's important to remember the what is this. Like, how do we get to an end state where something actually gets made, right? It's not enough to just kind of like put together this great presentation that sits on somebody's desk or hard drive for 20 years. You have to like actually affect human behavior. And that's what innovation is, right? If there's no effect to human behavior, you haven't really done innovation. To me, there's no innovative ideas, there's only innovative outcomes. So the way I do that is, I use the tool of rapid visualization every day in my process to help achieve that, to get people to kind of band to my idea. Like Bill said in the IBM presentation, it's always a big group of people that it takes to get something done. And so how can I inspire engineers, marketers, salespeople, retailers to kind of get into place on this idea? That's the way I do it. But I think more importantly, why I do it is important to remember every day. I think, yes, of course, a good design has to solve a real problem. It has to be kind of sustainable from a business perspective. But for me, the why for me is more about, can I make something that has some kind of a lasting secondary value? Because for me, as an industrial designer, I think about how people, they don't live in Frank Lloyd Wright houses. They don't have Picassos on their walls, right? But they have these things, these objects in their life. And can I help to create something that maybe will bring a little additional joy and pleasantry to their day, and create something that maybe they develop a relationship with? And this watch is the first thing I put on in the morning and the last thing I take off at night. And I look at it probably 500 times in the day. And so we have this kind of this intimacy with the things all around us that we take for granted. And so how can I bring that to the forefront in a way that creates this love relationship where maybe somebody keeps it a little bit longer? And really that's, the most sustainable product is the product that someone keeps, right? Like in the triangle, reduce is the first step in the sustainability triangle. And so how do we create things that last longer? People have to love them. So that simple statement of I want to draw stuff from the future has sent me on this really interesting 20-year path from going to school at RISD and Domus in Milan to working for a small innovation consultancy on the East Coast. I worked at Nike for about 10 years, then Frog Design, and then a holding company here in San Diego, and then recently started my own studio. And everything I've done in that 20 years, I've tried to just make every product, tried to give that specialness to it. This was the first product ever brought to production in 1999. It was for Timex. I was a junior designer in the studio. The brief was they wanted to do a watch that was just different than they'd ever done before. And kind of my young brain was like, well, if every watch they make is symmetrical, we should make an asymmetrical watch and it'll like automatically be different. But being kind of the youngest designer in the studio, all the senior designers like, no, that's the project that we want to do. Yeah, you young kid, you get out of here. And I had this little thumbnail of this sketch on my desk, like maybe this big. And the design director came around right before the presentation to the VP of design at Timex, and he's like, what's that? And I was like, oh, it's just a little idea I had for asymmetrical watch. He grabbed it, went over to the photocopier, blew it up to 11 by 17, pinned it up in the middle of the presentation board. The VP of design came in, he was like, what's that? That's the best design on the wall, the director said. He's like, yeah, let's make that. They came out of the room and said, congratulations, kid, you just designed your first product. And it was just like, and it was a little, from this little doodle to that in 12 months. And if I hadn't done that little doodle, and if I hadn't just left it out, maybe a little conspicuously, on the corner of my desk, just kind of fuming, right? It would never have happened. And then when I went to Nike, the same thing. So, I was always just trying to find, like for me, like Nike's a big place. They have 1,000 designers. They make hundreds of products a year. I was never going to make Nike a cool brand. People had already done that. And so I was like, what's like the weirdest things I could work on? And so I was on a research trip in London, and I was taking the train to Paris, and I saw all these women running in high heels and an overnight bag to catch the train to Paris for the weekend. And I was like, would it be great if Nike, instead of making a high-performance running shoe or basketball shoe, what if we just made a really super comfortable little like ballerina slip-on that literally could fold in the middle and fit into a bag, it could fit into a purse. And I think the engineers are probably like, who is this kid? Like, why would we do this? But I could, I just kind of begged, borrowed, and stole so I could make prototypes. And Mark Parker, the CEO, saw one of the sketches. He's like, I like it, let's figure it out. A month later, I was on a plane to Korea, to the factory to get it made. And it sold all over Europe and Japan. And I remember a few years later when I moved to Boston, I was going into the apartment building I was moving into, and this woman opened the door and she was wearing a pair of these. And I said, where did you get those? Because you can't get those in the United States. And she's like, oh, I got it at this little store called Office in London. And she's like, how did you know you can't get them in the US? And I was like, oh, because I designed them. And she's like, can you get me another pair? This was a shoe I did for Marion Jones for her to walk around the Olympic Village in. And then I went from Nike to Jordan, so from doing these kind of like really high-end European women's shoes to working with Michael Jordan, Carmelo Anthony, Dwayne Wade. And for me, I actually I hate sports. And they thought that was hilarious because they're like, did you see me do the thing with the ball? No. Did you see me draw the shoe last night? No, okay. They thought it was funny. And they appreciated not working with a fanboy. And I looked at them as just kind of like this alpha user who was going to put the most extreme stresses on the product and like, what could I learn from them to make the product better so that the core consumer, who's a high school kid, gets a better product because it was designed for this elite athlete. And then once Nike bought Converse, I became design director at Converse. So trying to figure out how do we differentiate this kind of 100-year-old heritage brand that basically owns like the Eames chair of footwear, and how do we extend that into a bigger line and stay true to that brand's principles? You know, when we bought Converse, they were so excited. They're like, yeah, we're going to be like a mini Nike. And we're like, no, that's not why we bought you. We bought you because you're this other thing. And we want everybody that hates Nike to love you, and vice versa. And you know, we developed this kind of mantra that when you put on a pair of Nikes, you're a part of the Nike brand, but when you put on a part of Converse's, Converse is a part of you, right? It's more about this sense of expression, and how do we enable that through product and brand. And then I took a hard right turn. I became creative director. I just got bored. I did like 400 shoes. I felt like I made my contribution in that space. I became creative director at Frog Design San Francisco, where we did a lot of boxes with buttons on them, a lot of phones, really like a lot of phones, and like a lot more phones. Sometimes I did things that weren't phones, but looked like phones. And sometimes I just did rectangles. They're like, what is that thing? Oh, it's our magical RFID reader that tracks and spies on you all through your day. Like, well, I don't know if I want to do this stuff anymore. And so at the same time, I started to develop an independent practice just because I wanted to do things that were maybe a little bit more direct and weren't so much involved with a 24-month R&D cycle and a little bit lower budget. So I started working with this small company in LA called Icon. And it was a stark contrast from like designing these like very parameter-heavy smartphones to working with a custom fabricator who is making one-off vehicles that start at about $300,000 and go up to about $1 million for pretty much for celebrities to go to Starbucks in. But and I try not to think about that part so much. But you know, where I was drawing something and then it was being machined the next day and then being assembled onto a vehicle the day after that was this amazing like immediacy. And that I was able to then bring back into my practice at Frog Design. So this was a production interior we did for Koros, which is a Chinese car company. And after a few years at Frog, I connected with a company down here in Vista that had no internal design, but owned a bunch of different audio brands. They owned Polk Audio, Definitive Technology. Now they also own Denon and Marantz. And they knew how to make really great things. They knew how to sell those things, but they knew nothing about design and creating something for the way people lived. And I just saw it as an opportunity to add value. My friends are like, dude, what are you doing? You went from Nike to Frog to like some random company that nobody's ever heard of. But to me, that's the opportunity to do good design, right? Like I knew that I could do good design within a machine that's set up to do good design. Like to do bad design at Nike, you have to be terrible, right? But could I do good design at a company that didn't even know the value of design? So it helped these really old brands, like Polk's a 42-year-old brand, help them get into Bluetooth speakers and headphones and gaming, wireless smart speakers. That kind of, so started partnering with companies like Amazon and Google to do very much kind of IoT connected products. And the company just really never thought about these areas. And even just reinvigorating their core products, so just traditional home theater products, in a way that, again, using that same philosophy of like, could I create something that people just wanted? Like a home theater speaker like this lasts about 20 years. So you have to make something with this very long window in mind. And the average buy cycle on a product like that is 2 years. It takes someone 2 years of research to buy it. This is another, so same type of products, very different brand, very different sound signature, for a different persona, different price points. I could talk about that for 45 minutes, but we won't do that. And then just never stopping. So my first year, I was doing just the industrial design, and then I built a team of brand design. We redid all the websites, brought in videographers, we're doing the launch videos, doing everything from brand positioning and product concept to what the tag says at Best Buy, all under one design studio, all of everybody mixed up, and telling kind of one story all the way to production. And then even redesigning the workplace. So got to design the headquarters, rename the company, and really thought about what's the kind of environment that I kind of want my people to be in, and what does that mean? So for me, design it has no boundaries, and the sketch is a big part of that, right? Because I can visualize what I'm thinking and the conversation we're having. Like Alan was saying, I can win the conversation because everybody's just kind of like talking about ethereal things, and then I'm showing, but here's what it is. And now what everybody's just said just goes away. So this year I started my own studio, as I mentioned, and so that was just kind of been a culmination of a 20-year path of like, I just always wanted to do my own thing, and I get bored really easily, so this is a way to not be bored every day. So, some days I'm working on vehicles for sci-fi movies for Hollywood, and some days I'm working on chef's knives and everything in between, and architectural pieces, and it's good. It feels good. I don't have enough time to watch the video. You can go watch it on YouTube. So why is sketching so important? Like, we have so many tools, right? Like, we can visualize things in so many different ways. And so why is this kind of like tangible artifact so important? And so to answer that question, I want to talk a little bit about where did it come from? How many people have heard this saying? Right, it's like a picture's worth 1,000 words. This is a truism. It's a cute truism, but there is some truth to that. And I think it's because we're very visual creatures, right? The way we interact with the world is typically in a very visual way. And even though most people in the world don't sketch every day, people are very visually fluent. So, I mean, you can look at this, which is a pretty obviously high definition resolution drawing by M.C. Escher, and most people immediately can be like, oh, there's something wrong with that, even though they couldn't draw it. And I think it's because this is something that's very kind of embedded in who we are as humans, that we've been taking very kind of abstract information, concepts, and distilling them into a few lines for thousands of years. This is probably the first PowerPoint, right? Just like, somebody was standing up here like, buffalo, there, right? And it's just like, that's just who we are, right? And the interesting thing is, though, the earliest cave paintings that have been carbon dated go back about 40,000 years. And that's just the earliest that we've found. And linguists, there's a lot of doing research for this presentation was hard to get a number, but linguists have been debating how far back the spoken word goes. They estimate somewhere between 10 to 20,000 years. So even if we say 20,000 years, we've been drawing for double the amount of time that we've been speaking. And so I think kind of like in our caveman brain, we're just trained to see something and grok it and be like, I get that. I see what you mean now. And even when you look at early written languages, right? It's a written language, but these are drawings, right? These are pictograms. And then when you think of early books, the handwritten illuminated books, right? It was these monks hand transcribing these books, and it would have been probably a lot more efficient if they just wrote, but here they are just spreading the story out through pictures. And I think a sketch has the power to communicate kind of like deeper information that's maybe very hard to describe. Like here's this very kind of transcendent scene from an ancient Japanese print, and with very few lines, you get this kind of majestic sense of nature and man's scale in nature that if you used words, maybe wouldn't describe it as much as this quick image does. I mean, a drawing can explore the impossible. So these are some of Da Vinci's sketches for flying machines that it wouldn't be possible for man to fly till hundreds of years later. A sketch can be illegal. Another Da Vinci drawing, I mean, he could have gone to prison for this. At the time, it was very much illegal to dig up dead bodies and cut them up and draw them, but he wanted to explore that, and a sketch was a way to do that. A sketch can land you in jail. This is Galileo's star chart plotting out to show how the Earth was not the center of the solar system. A sketch can elevate something that's, many may consider kind of base and banal. These are French advertisements for bicycles, but they're freaking beautiful, right? And it's just a drawing. A sketch can predict the future. These are some of Antonio Santaella's drawings. He was an Italian futurist, an architect, who was killed very young in his 20s in World War I, but he left behind an archive of drawings that pretty much predicted the modern city. He believed that apartment buildings and Power plants and big public structures would be the kind of the cathedrals of the 20th century. And he was largely right. I mean, we're pretty much living in a world that this architect designed unknowingly. And a drawing could tell us something about ourselves, right? So, maybe you can point out something uncomfortable. I think we've all been probably seeing a lot of political cartoons this year. A drawing can take powerful people down a peg. And it can chronograph a career. So this is very early Frank Lloyd Wright drawing, pre-1900, I believe, for the Unity Temple outside of Chicago in Oak Park. And then a decade later, this is one of his houses. A couple decades after that, Falling Water. A few decades after that, this is one of the last houses he designed. And you can see this kind of like change in a thought process over, he's an architect who worked over a 60-year period. And then for industrial designers, what I am, this sketch has been a very powerful tool. So this is Raymond Loewy, 1935. This is another Loewy sketch. I mean, apart from being just kind of like a kick-ass sketch, I mean, it's just like a cool idea, right? This kind of like retractable T-top sketch from 1961. And the cool thing about a sketch is that it could be everlasting, right? Like somebody could look at the sketch now and be like, hey, we should make that. And I remember when I was at Nike, one of the VPs of design, Tinker Hatfield, he had this little sketch kind of like behind his desk, like pinned up on his wall from the 80s that he had done. And it just was just there. And I remember I was down there with one of the product line managers. I was always trying to like glean all of his like goodness. And the product line manager was like, hey, Tinker, what's that sketch? He's like, oh, it's this thing I designed in '85, and we didn't have the technology to make it then. I always just kind of liked the sketch. And I was like, well, do we have the technology to make it now? He's like, yeah, I guess we do. And the product line manager was like, can we scan that? And it got made 25 years later. And then sketching changes a lot over time. This is another Raymond Loewy sketch for Skylab, the only U.S. space station ever made. At the time Raymond Loewy was working, people were trying to make the sketches as big as possible. This is a painting, right? And it's just beautiful. And it's just because that was the style of presentation. You'd fly to meet your client, you'd present in person. And then when I came out of school in the 90s, the style of sketching for designers started to change. They started to get looser, rougher, bolder. This is a terrible one of my sketches, but of the time period. And the reason why it changed is because of this weird thing. We stopped flying to clients and we started faxing to clients. And it was just, we'd call the client up, we're like, turn on the fax machine, and then boom. And so you had to draw, you had to draw in a way that could be conveyed in this terrible medium. And the sketch will continue to change, right? So I mean, now, this is one of my pieces now. It looks very much like the old Raymond Loewy sketch, but it's designed to be emailed, right? So, or put on a screen. And so I know that I'm not held back by the limits of the production of the paper or how big of a tube I can roll up and fly to my client. I can send them something. And I think it's going to change a lot more in the next 10 years. So, we're starting to see kind of sketching directly in 3 dimensions. Hopefully, we'll be able to do it without the weird spaghetti strands, but I think like it's gonna continue to move. So, what's the purpose of a sketch? To me, the core purpose of a sketch is to communicate an idea. So if you don't have an idea, you really don't have a sketch. It's just a bunch of lines on a page. And the purpose of communicating that idea is so that I can get the idea out of my head and into your heads, right? And to me, I think that's really the fastest, most efficient way for me to do that is on the page. I mean, I could, put everything in CAD or create digital pixel perfect mock-ups for everything, but maybe it would take me a whole week to explore one idea. That kind of thinking, that kind of tool encourages depth, but a sketch encourages breadth of ideas, right? So you can go really wide, really fast, and it's very conversational, right? I can do a sketch, I can show it to you, you could draw on top of it. Now we've got this feedback loop going, right? And it's just like this circle can build and build and build, and the idea grows so much faster because everybody's throwing rocks at it, everybody's working on it, and the idea stops being my idea and it becomes our idea very quickly in a 10, 20-minute session. So now that you believe that, let's talk a little bit about the different kinds of sketches. So there's really 3 different types for ease of thinking. The first type is a conversation with yourself, an exploratory sketch. And it's not about being a pretty drawing, it's about transferring the idea and thinking on the page and really building that conversation with yourself to push yourself outward. The second type is communicative. So that's like maybe a drawing that's meant to communicate amongst your peers. So I'm with a bunch of other designers or people in development. I know that they can read a sketch. It doesn't have to be this amazing presentation drawing, but I want them to see my idea in a way that they get excited about it and we start that conversation. And then the last level is persuasive. So that is more of like, hey, I'm going to be presenting to the board or a retail buyer or an outside stakeholder, and I need them to believe in this thing, and so I need to get them excited. So I'm going to show you just a few examples of that from myself, my own work. This is a thumbnail exploration page I did for, I think it was for Waring, but for a line of waffle makers. And it was like something where it was a style exercise, and this is just a set of explorations on the page just for me. So the clients never saw this, and so I'm just really playing with, like, I have this technical package of the components, and how can I kind of connect the dots in the way that's most kind of visually compelling and usable. So it's like, oh, what if I kind of waterfall down the design so all the controls are kind of upward facing at a 45-degree angle and they're a little bit easier to see? Or what if I do something that's maybe a little bit more classic looking, and I'm trying to push and pull things? Or what if we move to this thing and it's like more like dials, it's a little bit easier to use, easier to turn, easier to understand. A similar exploration for a coffee maker brand. And a lot of times these kinds of sketches are just in my own book. So this is a door handle for, you know, the classic like push-pull thing. Like, is this thing a push or a pull? And thinking like, well, maybe on the pull one, there's like almost a sharp edge that faces you, so you wouldn't want to push it. You'd only want to pull it. Or maybe there's some kind of graphics across it that really tell you, like, this goes in this direction versus that direction. And then there's always like the worst sketch on the page that's kind of like the oh shit moment, and you're like, oh, that's what it is. It's a big pan, right? You're like, oh, that's push, right? And so then it goes from a communication with myself to, now I want to start showing that to other people. So, okay, here's push, and it's a giant embossed hand, and pull is an arrow that comes out, and you wouldn't want to push on that because it's kind of like a soft edge, but you'd want to grab on that. And so this level of sketch really is just like at the fidelity where I could talk to someone else about it. So it's like, okay, like I'm working with a furniture client, and I hate when I fall asleep in my favorite chair and I go like that, and then I wake back up. So can I have these like adjustable pillows? Or like, Mr. Engineer, can I get this material break? It could be that kind of a simple thing. Or like, can I have the whole back be a giant sheet of glass and have the lights below the glass? Is that possible? Like, there's no sense in me investing 80 hours in the design if I first just need to have a conversation with other people. Remember that sketch I told you for that watch, that very first watch? So this was the second drawing. After they came out of the room and like, congratulations, kid. Now you gotta like actually design it. And so this is starting to understand like, what are the elements of this sketch and how does it work? So with this device, this ring actually turned a series of other rings inside the watch, and there were metal contacts on those, so when the hands went around, that's what made the alarm go off. And then the bottom of this ring was actually geared to the crown, so if you're someone that flies a lot, like a design consultant, and you're changing time zones all the time, you didn't have to change the time with this tiny wheel. You actually just, you turned the big wheel to change the time. And then, you know, sketch moving up in fidelity, still not quite totally persuasive level. This is just a 2D sketch, it's not a 3D rendering, but a lot faster than a 3D rendering, but just starting to be like, oh, these are the materials I want. I want, you know, mesh in the front because it's stretchy and breathable, and I want this kind of leather in the back because it's a little bit more stable and it'll hold my heel in. So now starting to like get much more persuasive, right? So where you could show this, still it's only like maybe a 4-hour sketch, but you could show this to a retailer and get feedback, and they could start to give you feedback of like how many units we're going to buy off of this. And you know, when I was in the footwear industry, we work much on futures, where you're getting the sale before the thing even exists. and of course, as sketches progress, there's ways to do it where you're using a variety of mediums. So this sketch is a combination of a 3D model, an actual photo of a physical model, and then Photoshop, Illustrator sketching to explore, some of these kinds of things. Where in this case, this was for that Chinese car company. We had certain hard points in place, and we had a parallel team that was working on the interface, so mocking that up and showing how the hardware and software felt like one thing, and then understanding like, okay, what controls do we want to be physical, what controls do we want to be virtual, and how does it all come together and kind of hang as one thing. The automotive interior is a particular challenge because this is not one product. This is a landscape of products, and each of these products have a different function, and you have to not crash the car, so they all have to be very usable. And then again, so these are kind of different levels. So this was an early just two-dimensional sketch for a smartphone, but almost 3D CAD looking, and then the 3D CAD rendering. And it's just, again, each level represents kind of a different moment in time along the process. So those are the 3 different types. And when I'm thinking about when do I use what type, I often think about who the audience is for that sketch, right? So for me, I think of this a lot. Like a rendering is a statement, a sketch is a conversation. So where am I in this process? Do I want to be talking about what we can make, right? Then I want to be in this conversational stage. Or am I talking about what we will make? Then I want to be in this statement phase, right? And so it's another tool, and you have to consciously select that tool. It's really another design problem, that communication with those other stakeholders, and you need to employ the right tools to make it successful. And I think as a designer, that's a big part of what I do. I start in the process of what it can be, right? And when we start, it can be anything. In that white page, anything can happen, right? But I have to move the other stakeholders in the process from that open state. Are we at the diverge stage? And I have to move them through the funnel from what it can be to what it will be. And again, the sketch is a big part of that. If you guys want to learn more about this, I put a little bit more of my research into a book that is for sale. Small plug. I lowered the price for the week. So you can check that out. Or as Alan was saying, you can follow me on YouTube or on Instagram. I'm trying to do this kind of sketch a day project where every day I visualize a new concept, and it's going to culminate in my second book by the end of the year.